Welcome to the Minnesota Senate District 17 Candidate Forum, sponsored by the Willmar Area League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. It encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We believe it is essential for the public to hear and understand the views and commitments of the people running for elected office in Minnesota, and it helps equip voters to make informed decisions. The opinions of the candidates do not necessarily reflect positions of the League of Women Voters. My name is Suzanne Knapp-Getzik, and I'm a member of the League. Tonight, we will have approximately 1 hour to hear from the candidates Lyle Coonan and Andrew Lang. Each candidate will be allowed a 2-minute opening and closing statement with 90 seconds to respond to questions we have received on our League website and from the audience here this evening. Thank you, candidates, and welcome. We will begin with an opening statement from Lyle Coonan.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. And I want to also say thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing this forum and putting it on. Appreciate that. And I'm Lyle Coonan. I'm running for Senate in District 17. A little bit about my past. I was born in Willmar here and grew up in the Clark City and Maynard area. I graduated from high school, Maynard High School, and attended Willmar Votech back in the days before MnSCU. I took the ag production course at the Votech school at that time. Most of my adult life I was a dairy farmer, and back in 2000 I was elected to the Minnesota House and served in the House until April of 2012 when I was elected to the Senate in a special election to complete the term of the late Senator Gary Kubley. And then I ran again that fall in the general election and have been representing District 17, which includes Candy, Ohio, Swift, Chippewa, and most of Renville counties. And I've been representing that district since I took office in 2013. My wife and I have 4 sons. They're all grown and out of the house now. They all live and work in the district. In fact, they all live in Montevideo right now, it so happens. And we have 3 grandchildren, 2 granddaughters, and 1 grandson. And my wife works for a company that makes medical devices, and she works in Montevideo.
Thank you. Andrew Lang.
Hello, Suzanne. Again, I'd like to say thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting these forums on and giving us an opportunity to introduce ourselves to the area and the district as a whole. I grew up in Willmar. I was born in Willmar. I was the 3rd generation born in Willmar. I went to high school here. I graduated in 1997. I went to Ridgewater College out on the hill for a couple of years, and then I went to St. Cloud State and graduated there. I work full-time for Renville County as the county park supervisor. I take care of the county parks down there, and it's 1,500 acres. It's a lot of work, but I enjoy it thoroughly. I'm married. My lovely wife, Susan, and my 2 sons, Ellie and Jonas, are 5 and 9. One of the big things that I pride myself on is my military service. I've been in the military 15 years. I'm a current active drilling member of the Minnesota Army National Guard. I am currently serving as a major logistics officer in 30 Combat Aviation Brigade. I've done a couple of tours to Iraq, once in 2007, 2008, and we were part of Operation Operation Iraqi Freedom. In 2014, 2015, I did another tour to Iraq, and that was part of Operation Inherent Resolve. The Army has been a large portion of my life. It kind of defines who I am. And I just like everybody to know that I appreciate all the support that they've given me over the years, and thank you.
Okay. I will switch back and forth and give you each a chance to start an equal number of questions. So we'll start with you, Andrew. If pre-K education is passed, how do you think it should be funded?
Well, that's a good question. I know that Governor Dayton has pushed out and it's been in excess of $100 million. And I know that the school districts in the past have somewhat been apprehensive about receiving that funding. Now, what I would say is I'm not in support of what you would call 0 to 4 one-size-fits-all pre-K education. Now, what I would say is that some of that funding could go specifically towards targeted groups. Now, the groups that I would be talking about targeting are obviously lower-income individuals, kids that have, some learning disabilities of one kind or another. And I think that's really the way I'd like to see that program go. As far as the function for funding it, when you start talking about adding $100 million to the program, and as far as the education formula goes, I think you kind of get into a tough situation of exactly where do you want that money to go? Do you want it to go to the pre-K, or do you want it to go to the K through 12? So that's kind of my standpoint on that.
Okay. Lyle, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes.
If pre-K education is passed, how do you think it should be funded?
If the state's going to require it, then the state should pay for it. I think that if we would step back and let the local districts address the issue, they would handle it a lot like all-day, everyday kindergarten. And most districts actually had all-day, everyday kindergarten by the time the state stepped up and set up a program. But if the state is going to go ahead and say that all schools are going to do that, it needs to be paid for. There are pretty good evidence that pre-K is important and helps kids through their learning years, of course, but through their whole life. But if the schools have to cut funding in the later grades or in high schools to shift money to the pre-K, then I believe the advantages to pre-K would disappear in that. So it has to be paid for. Another thing I would like to add is that I would like to see each school district be able to design their own program. And for parents, I believe it should be voluntary.
Thank you. The next question, and this is for you, Lyle. First, as you go door-to-door campaigning this election season, what are constituent concerns you are hearing from your potential constituents? Consistent concerns, I'm sorry.
Well, as of the last few weeks, I hate to say it, but they're getting sick of all the negative mail. And I can't argue with that one bit. I think that the outside money coming in is a real problem. These groups that form, they make up names and then just put a bunch of money into our districts out here. I think that's a real problem to our system of democracy, actually. They set their own agenda, and a lot of times they have nothing to do with what's going on in the district. And so that I'm pretty concerned about. But to switch from that subject, other things I hear about at the court is education is very important to people. Healthcare is now, and the affordability, which is something we need to address. Property taxes also gets to be a concern. So those are some of the things that I'm hearing when I'm out visiting with people.
Thank you. Andrew, what consistent concerns are you hearing when you go door to door?
9 out of 10 people, it's healthcare. That's what they're concerned about. That's what they are struggling to pay. That is the number one issue by far. I would say that there are some tax issue concerns that have been brought up. But yeah, by far, number one, healthcare.
Okay, you get the next one first. There is interest in Minnesota family law reform regarding fathers' rights. Do you feel this reform is needed?
Absolutely. It's actually, that was one of the first topics that when I started this campaign came to me. It's something that I experienced personally within my own family, and it's something that is pretty near and dear to my heart, really. Fathers have historically been on the short end of the stick when it came to custody, and honestly, in the court system, they've come to the short end of the stick. As far as to how to address that, there are several ways that you can go about doing it. The vast majority of those would be on a federal level. There are some things we can do in the state, and I think looking at those for the near future, and especially when it comes to family law, obviously are going to be a good step in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Lyle?
Yeah, I agree there needs to be some reform done there. This is something that's been on the table for a while now, and not to anybody's surprise here, I'm sure, that gets to be very controversial in committee meetings, but I do believe there has to be something done to make the whole situation in family law fairer to all involved, both parents. And there's even situations where grandparents are concerned that sometimes grandparents never get to see their grandkids. And so I think there's a lot of work to do in that area. But again, it's difficult, and I know there's a lot of strong feelings about how we should handle this, but it's important, and we need to get to work on it. Or I should say, we need to continue the work on it.
Okay, thank you. Lyle, what is your position on contracting with for-profit, privately run corporations to increase prison beds in Minnesota?
That's something that we've had in Minnesota in Appleton, but I think when you look at how that works and the unstableness of it, the prison populations go up and down and they're not very stable, I would rather see that prison in Appleton bought by the state and operated by the state. I think for the area out here, Appleton and the area, you'd see a lot more consistency in the number of people that are working there, and you wouldn't see the big increases and then unfortunately decreases in the usage of that prison as far as the number of prisoners there. So I think for the local economy, a lot more stable if we're state operated.
Thank you. Andrew?
The Appleton prison is an issue that has come up again in this campaign. What I would say is, as far as Willmar is concerned, a lot of the people in Willmar really haven't been, I would say, possibly educated on the topic. And people in western part of the district are ultimately familiar, and closely so, with the impact of these 300 jobs that would happen when the prison would open. What I would say is that as far as CCA or any owner of that, I think that's secondary to the fact that the prison needs to be open. And that being said, right now we're 350 prisoners over what the state can handle. 550, I believe it is. And of that 550, they've been farmed out to the counties, and the counties have been taking care of those prisoners. Those prisoners aren't getting the rehabilitation they would in a prison system. They're not getting the exercise in the yard. They're not getting access to a library that they would in a prison facility. 2 years ago, we were this close to authoring a bill for $141 million to add on to the Pine City prison and add 500 beds. Some quick math could tell you that that's not going to take care of the issue that we have. The Appleton prison is a 1,660-bed facility. It could be up and operational in a short amount of time. As far as the state buying it, I would say that is a good idea. I personally believe that it is one of those topics that is very, all the citizens out there, that was the one thing at the fair they kept coming up and telling me again and again and again, you need to get that prison open, you need to get that prison open. And it's a no-brainer. We need to open that prison. And that's where I'm going with that. As far as CCA is concerned, it doesn't matter to me. We need to do this.
Thank you. This is kind of in the same vein. What is your position on voting by felons living in the community who have successfully fulfilled their probation and parole goals? Andrew, please.
I would support that. When they're done with all their papers, as the term goes, when they're off their papers and they're a productive member of society, I would say that their voting rights should be restored.
Thank you. Lyle?
And that's my position also, that once they've done their time and done everything they need to do, that they should be able to vote. Many states do that now, so that's
Thank you.
Needs to be done.
Okay, Lyle, you're first on this one. To what do you attribute the inability of the legislature to get the work done during the 2015-2016 session?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that quite a bit of stuff did get done during the 15 and 16 biennium, but the gridlock, what happens when we can't get things moving along, I think part of that is people dig into their positions too much and are unwilling to compromise. This is a democracy, and after all, the voters did give us a government with Republicans controlling the House, Democrats controlling the Senate. And I don't think they did that expecting gridlock. They expected compromise. And so that's, I think, what we need to do is make sure and compromise. And the finger pointing doesn't do any good either. That just irritates the situation more. But we need, the legislature is a place, and it's supposed to be this way, where everybody brings their ideas there and they get debated, and you know, the merits of each idea is considered. And but as we move along and everybody's voices are heard, those who want to be heard anyway, and we consider all the ideas, by the time we get to the end of the session, a decision has to be made, and in the case of the last biennium, there has to be compromise. And that's what was missing, was the compromise.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like me to read it again?
Yeah, if you would.
Okay. To what do you attribute the inability of the legislature to get work done during the 2015-2016 session?
Well, I would say there was a lot of good law being passed. The number one thing I would say is trust. And I think I've said this before in a forum, and I'm going to repeat it now, and I'm going to say that trust, when the House had passed a bill, and I know this was in the close of session, it was last minute, and that bill was supposedly agreed upon by the Senate, and when it went to the Senate, it got pushed off, and it was for Southwest Light Rail. And whatever your opinion is on Southwest Light Rail is kind of secondary here. The fact is that was agreed upon, and that's a breaking of trust between whatever party you are. It doesn't matter. If you agreed upon something, fulfill your agreement and move on from there. Now, what I would say is that and this is not a novel idea, gridlock, it is not necessarily a bad thing. I think if there can't become some sort of an agreement between the two parties, whatever they may be, maybe there's three parties, doesn't matter, that it serves its purpose. And I know people don't like to hear that, and I know that on certain circumstances, I don't like to hear that they're not getting anything done, but I think that we overreact a lot of times when gridlock is used as a negative, but I think it serves its purpose.
Well, this is a perfect segue into the next question, and it's for you first, Andrew. Do you support your party's position on the Southwest Light Rail and the bonding bill? Why or why not?
Well, I do. I'm not anti-mass transit by any means. Light rail can be effective. Light rail can be effective in states that can house it. Minnesota isn't one of those states. It's a huge undertaking. It's a huge cost. And, the cost of the state, however, is pretty significant as well. The fact that got brought into the bonding bill when, there was a great bonding bill. And to be honest, I was pretty impressed with the bonding bill, watching it from my seat, from my point of view, seeing it go through the House. 89% bipartisan support. That's unheard of. That's great. Good job, legislators. And it went to the Senate with the expectation of it being passed. And yeah, Southwest Light Rail, like I said, I'm not anti-mass transit, but in this certain circumstance, it definitely is not for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Lyle, do you support your party's position in Southwest Light Rail and the bonding bill? Why or why not?
Well, first of all, I'm not really all that concerned about the party's position. And having said that, I'm going to go on and say that light rail, for me personally, I represent District 17. It's not that important of an issue. But I think when you look at the whole picture, bonding bills are set up to be passed with a supermajority. And in the case of this House and Senate this year, that means you need votes from both parties. Another thing it does is spread projects around the whole state. If you don't get that, you don't get a supermajority. And so, having said that, the amendment was offered to the bonding bill in the Senate to add light rail. The reason it was added to that bill, because the House sent the bill over with transportation projects in it. It was the Senate's intention to have light rail in the transportation bill. And at the end there, the bonding bill ended up being the transportation bill also. So that's why it ended up there. It's also important to note that bill, after the amendment was added in the Senate, that it passed with a supermajority, votes from both parties. That's important to note. Another thing I think is important to keep in mind when it comes to bonding bills that need supermajorities, a lot of those districts in those metro areas are very small geographically and don't actually get bonding projects in them. And so a lot of these people that are representing those areas there, they considered that their project. And why would they vote for a bill if they don't get a project? And again, it goes back to a supermajority to spread projects all over the state and to make sure they're balanced between Republicans and Democrats. So another way to put that would be, what if somebody decided to cut all the projects in west central and southwestern Minnesota out of the bill? I wouldn't be voting for it either, so I can understand why we would have had trouble passing that bill in the Senate without that provision. But as far as transit goes, for me personally, the transit here in rural Minnesota is much more important. We have a higher percentage of the adult population doesn't have a driver's license here, and a lot of that's due because we have an older population. But transit for us is very important in our part of the state.
Well, there are more questions about moving Minnesotans here, and here's one, comes to you first, Lyle. What do you think would be the most effective way to fund completion of the 4-lane Highway 23?
Well, so far, the best way that we've made progress on that is to put money into corridors of commerce, and that project ranks very high on corridors of commerce. So any money that's gone into corridors of commerce, Highway 23 will more than likely get some of that. So that's important to remember. But now to look at the bigger transportation issue, we need to find long-term ongoing funding for the MnDOT, for cities and counties and townships to do proper funding. They need to be able to plan out ahead a number of years, and they need to know how much money is coming out will be coming to them in 4 or 5 years. So it has to be long-term. Now, the type of funding, I'm willing to compromise. Personally, I was willing to take the House funding proposals, the Senate funding proposals, right-size all of them so it meets the levels we need, and then accept all of them. If you start cutting some of those funding sources out, it loads up the other funding sources and makes it more difficult to pass politically. And a true compromise, anybody will be able to find something wrong with it. And so I think that we should have compromised and considered all of the funding sources for long-term funding.
Andrew, do you have a response on what would be the most effective way to fund completion of the 4-lane Highway 23?
Well, I think the first step would be passing the bonding bill that had $700 million for transportation in it. You know, that's one thing. This first thing, next session next year, is to go after, take the bill that was written last year, change the number, and put it to the floor. Now, the corridors of commerce distinction that Highway 23 has gotten is actually a very important piece to that. It puts it a high priority list. It's 212, I believe, is also on that list. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lyle.
Yeah.
I think that's correct. Those two corridors from west central Minnesota to the metro area are going to be obviously pretty important. They're going to be important in the future. They're important now. Highway 23 will get finished. It'll be a 4-lane all the way to St. Cloud. So bonding bill is the first way to do that.
Thank you. Okay, Andrew, you're first on this one. What will you do, or what would you do to increase affordable housing options?
Well, you know, west central Minnesota needs affordable housing, there's no doubt. I know in District 17 that workforce housing is in rural Minnesota is at a big loss, especially in northern Minnesota when it comes to mining and you know, I know that some of the Moorhead area, they've had a lot of issues with some of the miners trying to find, or excuse me, oil drillers trying to find places to live. You know, a house is a base for a productive family. It's how a family thrives. It's how their children learn, their citizens become productive. What I want to make very clear is that affordable housing for me does not mean public housing. Public housing is a step that I'm not prepared to take. I think that, there's a couple of ways we could go about doing that. I think incentives could be offered to builders around the area to build affordable housing. And I think we've talked in the past about gap financing to make up for some of the difference between what those builders would be charging and what they'd actually be being paid. I am hesitant, however, last week during the forum, I think a similar question was asked, and I heard the figure of $100 million get thrown out there, at least, is the actual phraseology, and that worries me somewhat, because I think that that's a portion of government. If you start talking about just throwing money at things without really looking at an issue and how you're going to spend that money on each issue, we have a problem. That's where we get ourselves in a situation we don't want to be in, as far as I'm concerned.
Lyle?
Yes, housing is important. Children that have a stable housing do better in school, and adults that live in stable housing are better able to keep jobs. So it is important. The $100 million that was in the last bonding bill for housing, and that was I don't know if we ever had a number that high before, but what was really good about that for our part of the state is before that time, most of that bonding housing money stayed in the metro area. In that bill, some of that actually made it out to rural Minnesota, which I think is a good thing. The housing issues, for some reason, there was the idea it was only a metro issue, but it's here too. Affordable housing and workforce housing. Other things we've been working on to address the housing issue is to expand the use of TIF districts, the tax increment financing districts, and that's what local units of government use for business development and property development, that kind of thing, to also allow them to use that for housing development. Another thing we were looking at is tax credit for developers, and they could use that credit to lower the cost of the housing product, whatever they're building, so that when they're finished, it's more affordable for people with low incomes, but also really important now for workforce housing also. So those are some of the things we're looking at and working on.
Okay, thank you. Changing focus a little bit, this person writes, the last 2 legislative sessions produced giant steps backward on most environmental issues. What, if elected, will you do to help Minnesota with clean air, clean water, and wise land use? You first, Lau.
Well, I know there's that idea that there was, with some people, that there was steps backwards, but I don't agree with that. There's nothing that we did to change what the MPC does as far as permitting. They've still got to meet all the same requirements. And the DNR with the water permitting and stuff, there's nothing that was reduced there. So I'm not real clear about the steps backwards. I have heard that used before, though. But water is very important. And I think I've been supporting funding to the DNR to test both the quantity of our groundwater and the quality. I think we need to know that for future planning, how much water we have, and of course, is it drinkable? We need to know that. As far as surface water goes, there's been a lot of progress made there. Cities, of course, and anybody who's involved with city government knows this, that cities have really been under the gun to meet the water quality standards. And farms also, there's a much more testing going on now as far as discharge into rivers and streams. And the testing is so detailed that they can actually figure out if there is a problem, where it's coming from. You can say some of the problem is like phosphorus discharge. How do you pinpoint where that's coming from, especially if you're out in farm country? But their testing is getting better and better, and they can actually figure out which section it's coming from or be able to identify the problem, which I think is really good, because then we can use available funds more efficiently and actually address the problem rather than use a shotgun approach. There's one thing I am concerned about, though, and Governor Dayton did recognize this, is that the cost to cities, because when you look out into the future, it's pretty clear that the requirements are going to become much more stringent than they are now. And so that cost to cities is something I'm really concerned about, and that's something we're going to have to address as we move forward.
Thank you. Andrew, what if elected would you do to help Minnesota with clean air, clean water, and wise land use?
So is it the same question, or do we not take a step backwards?
You mean, you want the first sentence?
No, that's fine. I would have to say that, with all the MPCA, the local soil and water conservation districts, the local DNR office work that I work with on a normal, everyday basis, there's great strides made. Even the buffer strip that was done in the name of clean and healthy water. We're talking about 110,000 acres statewide that's gone towards clean water. So I guess I would continue some of those programs. Some of them, there's a little bit of, call it a little too much red tape when it comes to building new homes, building businesses in local and rural Minnesota. And that's I think, there's a quid pro quo probably a little bit when it comes to what the proper amount of oversight is and, what it would be good for small businesses.
It's a candidate forum, but it's okay if you agree. For you, Andrew, first, would you work to repeal the buffer strip bill?
So the buffer strip bill is a complicated thing. Looking at it from my point of view, if it's done in the name of water quality, which, it has, and there's also been a couple of, confusing, misleading statements from the governor that is done for habitat. Now, what I would say about the buffer strip is that there's some muddy science when it comes to how it was introduced. One thing in particular is the University of Minnesota's study was thrown out when they first introduced the buffer strip bill. The thing that concerns me is there's no check on learning. There's no 5 years in the future. If we look at water quality, what if it hasn't improved? What if it's gotten worse? Are the buffer strips working? I had several in-depth conversations with scientists that are much smarter than I am that told me that it doesn't necessarily stop all the, realistically it works very good for sediment, but not necessarily for chemicals. And it's a significant piece of land we're pulling out of production. It's a significant piece of property that we're pulling from these farmers. And if we're going to do that, I want to have some sunset, some way to check on the end of it and make sure we're doing what we set out to do. That's really my point on buffer strips.
Thank you. Lyle?
No, I wouldn't repeal it. I think it's important to note that there's been a buffer strip law since 1977. Most people don't seem to realize that, but the buffer strip law has been around that long. The changes that were made a couple of years ago brought in more ditch systems, brought in the requirement that they have buffer strips. Under the old law, they would have eventually got there. It would have just taken a little longer. Now, I support the idea of buffer strips, and I did that, and I can tell you what I did. On my farm, my parents did the same, my brother did the same. On our farms, we've had buffer strips since the late 70s, and we never signed up for any program to take government money to do it either. We just did it because it was the right thing to do. Having said that, though, I realize that not everybody can do that. If it's a young farmer who's just bought some land, he's got high payments to make, he probably can't afford to do that. So we need to look at helping some of the landowners or farmers that are installing those. So some of the ideas been going around about that is to assess the entire drainage system. So even if the water from the farm is flowing into that ditch system, but they don't have a ditch on their farm, they would help pay for that land the buffer is on. That's one way of doing it. There's been some other ideas too of having the state pay, either the general fund or the dedicated funding from the sales tax, to use some of that money. And I don't know for sure where we're going to end up yet. There are some programs in place now, but they keep running out of money, and that's RIM and
CRP.
CRP, thank you. And so there are some in place now. But To answer your question, I wouldn't repeal it, but I would make some changes, because in some areas, I don't think buffers do a lot of good, or in other areas, the buffer strip should even be enhanced and cover more area. And so I would like to see the changes made so that the effort, and if there's cost, the money is more targeted, and I think we'd end up with a better net effect.
Thank you. Question for you first, Lyle. In light of the fact that most agree our Minnesota infrastructure of roads and bridges have deteriorated, what specific budget or bonding plans do you think could be agreed upon and passed to fund it?
Well, actually, the bill that was passed, that passed off the House floor and then the Senate floor that had the light rail added to it, that was a pretty good bill. And so something like that, I think, is possible again in a upcoming session. Now, that's, of course, bonding. If you look at trunk highway bonds, we're just about up to our capacity there, and those are the only bonds that can be used on state roads. GO bonds can't be used on state roads, but they can be used on local roads. So I think it's important to remember that, too. It's not an endless supply of money to use bonds. If we use GO bonds for roads, that would be local roads, then it's important to remember that bonding bills can only be so large, and then you just run in, it's politically impossible to pass them. And if we start increasing the amount that goes towards transportation, you're reducing the amount that goes to other infrastructure and even water quality and stuff like that, all the other things that end up in bonding bills. And so I'm going to say again, the real solution to transportation is long-term ongoing funding. I'm not against bonding, but that's not the only answer.
I have a question. Is GO general obligation?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Sorry, that general obligation bonds, yeah.
Andrew?
I would say that the same bill that was run across the floor at the House and went to the Senate, that $700 million for transportation would be a dang good start. From that point, change the number on it, send it back to the floor, I bet it would pass. It had $700 million in there. Like I said, it had very good bipartisan support before. As far as sustainable funding goes, I would agree with that. I've had a couple of county engineers that have, well, let's just be honest, they tracked me down and said, you need to have some sustainable funding. We need to be able to plan for our future. We need to be able to know what we're going to get years in advance, so we can have a restructuring or a resurfacing structure for all of our roads in the upcoming years. I tend to agree with that. I think it's kind of a no-brainer, where as far as the state goes, at least they know what they're going to be putting into the budget every year for transportation, and counties know what they're going to be receiving, or whatever the municipality may be.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going from healthy infrastructure to healthy people. The question here is, how do we fix the problems with MNsure and the rate increase in Greater Minnesota?
Well, this is kind of the question of the last year. Like I said, this is something that every time I go to the door, this is 9 out of 10 people. They're concerned, they're worried, they don't know how they're going to pay for it. Let's be honest, MNsure is a disaster. The premiums are outrageous. They're driving, I think we just got word they're up to 67% increase November 1st. 67% increase in premiums. That is amazing. I ran into a gal out at the Appleton at the Swift County Fair. She told me a story of, she has 4 kids under 10 years old, married, both working, farmer family, and they don't have health care because they can't afford it. They simply cannot afford it. She said it used to be $400 a month, it used to be $500 a month, now it's over $900, and he said it's too much. Can't afford it. Paying for a mortgage, it's a tough situation to be in. I'm not a very one-sided politically. I never have stood up here and blamed Democrats for anything or blame Republicans for anything. That's just not my standpoint. That's not what I'm here to do, except on this issue. This is a very one-sided issue. There isn't one Republican in the state that stood up and voted for this. There's not one Republican in the nation that stood up and voted for this. there's significant change in this law is only going to happen at the federal level. That's unfortunate. However, there are a few things we can do at the state level. One of those is create tax deductions for the Minnesotans that don't qualify for group coverages. Now, this is part of the Minnesota Senate's plan. They're trying to attack this head on and come out with a plan and try to fix this. So that's the group that usually pays the highest premiums is the ones that don't qualify for those group coverages. Obviously, we're going to try and increase choice. By allowing Minnesotans to qualify for group coverage, a good example of that would be a farm co-op. They could start their own group plan and go in from that point. And then just one more is open the private market to the Minnesotans that qualify for those public programs. Those are three easy, let's call them easy, but let's just say they're 3 steps as Minnesotans that we could take to help relieve some of the pressure brought on from Insure.
Lyle?
All right, this is a very important issue, and the healthcare needs to be addressed. The cost is running out of hand, and it has to be addressed. First, I would like to say that MNsure is just the exchange. It has nothing to do with the premiums that insurance companies want to charge. I mean, that's not the case. If you look at other states, they use the federal exchange, they're seeing the same thing we are. Blues pulled out, premiums are going up at the same rate, so it's not the exchange that's causing that. Now, that's not to say the exchange doesn't have problems, technology problems, because it does. And I'm not, totally and completely 100% behind the Minnesota exchange. We got to save it. I would sure consider the federal exchange if it's better. Because if we do away with MNsure, we'll be on the federal exchange. That's the way it is. I keep asking the questions, is the federal exchange, does it work better? Is the technology better? And what will it cost Minnesota? And I just haven't got a clear answer on that. It's something I'll keep checking on. If it is better, I'll support going to the federal exchange. If it's not, then we should stay with MNsure. Now, to address the costs going up, there's a few things we can do. Tax credits, the federal credits go up to a certain income level, and when they run out, it's still those people that are in this individual market. It's really expensive. I think the state could step in at that point and pick up and offer some more credits. Just some ideas. Another one is move the eligibility for MNsure up to 275% of the poverty level. Another thing, and this wouldn't cost nothing, is it's estimated there's about 100,000 people that aren't on the exchange. They're out in the market outside of the exchange that are eligible for the credits. And so if that 100,000 would get their insurance within the exchange, they would get help too. We could fix the family glitch. That's where if the breadwinner gets insurance at the business they work at, and for that breadwinner to add the rest of the family is very expensive. But because that breadwinner's insurance is very affordable, that makes the rest of the family ineligible for the tax credits on the exchange. So stuff like that we can fix. And I'm willing to look at ideas from the other side of the aisle or wherever they come from. But this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed.
Just to tag on a short question with this one, do you think there will be a special session on this issue? Lyle?
Well, since we adjourned, there are several times I thought we were going to have a special session and not on this issue, just have a special session, and it didn't happen. So I have to admit I'm running out of optimism. But the catch is that once you get to election day, it's only about 2 months until the regular session starts. So this is my guess. I don't think there will be a special session, but I do believe that legislators will start working on this and actually maybe even hold committee meetings. So I think the work will start, but I don't think I doubt if there will actually be a special session on this subject.
Andrew, do you have any sense about this?
Yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath. I don't see it happening.
Okay. Andrew, you're first. How can the legislature improve access and availability to quality and affordable child care for working families?
So the tax bill the governor vetoed had some child care tax credits in it that would have been great. It would have been great for me. I have 2 small kids. I would have liked that. That's about it. I mean, that's a good first step. I mean, that's that's a challenge for anybody that's in my shoes that has 2 kids in daycare or possibly more. It's a significant cost on a monthly basis. So yeah, I tell you what, it's very good that the legislator is aware of that and they're working on an issue, and I appreciate it as a parent and a person that pays for daycare. So.
Lyle, do you have something to add to that?
Well, there's some things we can do with the child care subsidy. There's a lot of people on a waiting list, and I think we can start to address that a little bit. I'm not going to, mislead anybody here. There's no way we can solve that all at once because it's quite a bit of money, but I think we can make some progress there. The other thing, of course, is the tax credits, and that's a good idea. The other thing I think we can do is try and ease up on the regulations on daycare providers. It's very cumbersome for them to get started, and some providers just get tired of all the regulation and reporting and just quit. They don't want to do it anymore. And I think there's one more thing that I would like to see is to set up a grant program for people who would like to start a daycare, because there is a fair amount of cost to start, and of course the grant would be competitive, and it would be based on the need in the area and what the plan is. But I think that would help some too, to make some more daycare available also.
This question kind of ties the last 2 together a little bit. This person writes, in Massachusetts, all children under 5 are insured. Would that be something you would support?
Insured?
Yeah. It doesn't say if that means medical insurance, I would guess.
Well, if that's what it means, that's a great idea. In Minnesota, and I got to think now, it's been a while, but I think up to 1-year-old, everybody's insured. At least that's the way it was when my kids were little. But Minnesota Care was part of that too. I remember there was a time when my wife and I were first married and our kids were little, that Minnesota Care was just for children, and our kids were on it, even though Sandy and I couldn't get it at the time. But I think it's a good idea to have children covered. In fact, I think everybody should be, adults too, but it's a good idea. Yeah.
Andrew?
Yeah, I guess I can't comment as far as the specificity of Massachusetts law, but I guess I'd be open to 0 to however many years old.
5.
That 5, is that what it is? Okay. Yeah, I guess it's an intriguing thought. As far as Minnesota Care, I my kids were never covered unless we were covered when they were born. So I'm a couple years behind Lyle, but yeah, I know. I mean, I guess I'd be open to the idea. Exactly how that would work at this point, it'd be tough to say.
Okay. Well, we've covered particular issues, but this is sort of a general question, and that is, what particular values do your constituents want to see in their representatives? Andrew?
Well, I was going to cover that on my closing statement, but I'm going to do it now. I'm going to throw back to my military. The things about being in the military, the things that are instilled in you, the honor, the integrity, the trust, the leadership that by force, for the most part, is instilled upon you in the military. But you take those traits with you. I don't know if I'd be the same man I am today if I hadn't gone in the military. I don't know. But what I can say is that, I try very hard. I try to be a good person, and I think some of those qualities and those traits that I've learned in the military would serve St. Paul well, would serve the district really well, would serve the citizens of District 17 as well as I could. So I think that's something that's missing on both sides of the aisle. I said I can't say one way or another whether or not all the rest of the representatives or senators in St. Paul feel the same way I do on those issues, but that's how I feel.
Okay, thank you. Lyle, what do your constituents want to see in their representatives as far as values?
Well, I think what people really want is for their representative in the legislature to represent their values and be representative of what's wanted in the district here at home. I know at the Capitol, sometimes you end up with what I call the fishbowl effect. During the session, you spend so much time there, and you're constantly bombarded by what people around you are saying, that it's a little bit of a challenge sometimes to stay focused and remember what people back home want. But when I go down there, I like to make my decisions on what I call the 3 C's. And the 3 C's are, the first one is my conscience, and of course that was developed here. I grew up in this part of the state, so my conscience was developed right here. So it's conscience, constituents, and then caucus last. And I think that's important too, to keep those in that order. And then another thing I should add is that our legislature is a citizens legislature. It's a part-time legislature, and that's really important too. Most legislatures actually do have other jobs or run businesses or farm, or and so that helps the legislature, and that helps me. I know that also stay in touch with what's going on back at home.
Thank you. This concludes the question and answer session of our program, and we will begin closing statements with Andrew Lang.
Well, I think I kind of killed my closing statement with what I just said, but what I would like to say is, this is an adventure for me. The military, like I said, I've spent 15 years in the military, and I've had all kinds of crazy adventures with the military. This ranks right up there, this process, this endeavor of running for political office. It's a commitment. Wow, it's been a lot. What I'd like to say is, thanks for having us here, but I'd like to give a good thanks to my wife and my family, my friends that have been helping me do this along the way. Without them, I wouldn't be sitting in this seat right now. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak with you and kind of give my views and opinions on some topics. So, thank you.
Thank you. Lyle?
Okay, and again, I'd like to say thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting on this forum. I appreciate that. It's a good way to get us as candidates to get the message out. And also, I appreciate Andrew. We've been in a few debates and forums before, and I appreciate his good character and his outstanding way of debating. So. Also, and I got to do this too, I got to thank my wife and kids. The campaigns can be grueling, and they're all consuming, and they just run your lives for a few months. But my wife and kids have been very supportive over the years, and I appreciate that. Also, having been fortunate enough to be elected, my wife Sandy, while I'm gone all week in St. Paul, she ran the house, and she did a good job of it. So I really appreciate that from Sandy too. And my kids, I know that sometimes, especially when they were younger, it was a little hard, but I tried to call them every night and stay in touch. And I would, as they got older, I would drive back for their sports events and then turn around and drive back to St. Paul. So there was some extra work and some sacrifice, but I really appreciate what my family did also. And again, thanks to everybody who's here also. Appreciate that.
Well, after hearing your closing statements, we would like to thank you for your willingness to run for public office and to share your views with us tonight. Our thanks also goes to RAC 8 TV, KWLM Radio, and the West Central Tribune for their commitments to keeping us all informed of the candidates' views in this election season. This forum is aired live and streamed and on demand on the City of Willmar website at willmarmn.gov and RAC channels 18 and 181, and it is also on demand at KWLM Radio. In closing, the League would like to remind voters there is also a constitutional amendment on the ballot this year. Information on it and details of this amendment can be found on the Secretary of State's website and deals with who should set pay for Minnesota legislators. Remember, a non-vote on amendments is counted as a no vote. Thank you, candidates, League of Women Voters volunteers here tonight, and viewers. Election Day is November 8th. Please inform yourselves and vote. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.